The valley was silent except for the slow whisper of the wind moving through the stone ridges. At the edge of that valley sat a figure unlike any other. She was enormous, her body rising higher than the tallest cliffs around her. Her skin was pale like moonlight, and her silver eyes reflected the sky as if they were mirrors of forgotten stars. She was the last of her kind, the last giantess of her people. Once, long ago, this valley had been alive with voices. Her people had walked these plains, tall and proud. They had built towers from the white stone and carved songs into the cliffs. Their laughter had once carried across the mountains, and their fires had burned warm against the cold nights. She remembered those days with a pain that pressed heavy on her heart. That life was gone now. The towers had fallen into ruins. The songs had faded into echoes, and the laughter had been swallowed by silence. She had survived. Only her. She did not know if survival was a blessing or a curse. Her strength had kept her alive, but it had also trapped her in a prison of loneliness. Every day she walked the ridges, searching for something to fill the emptiness. The world stretched endlessly, but it was hollow. Even the stars above, once a comfort, now felt distant and cold. Her voice, when she allowed herself to speak, rolled like thunder through the empty valley. But what use was a voice when no one remained to answer? Sometimes, out of habit, she whispered her people's names to the cliffs as if they might answer back. They never did. Only her own echo returned, reminding her how alone she truly was. The giantess carried centuries of memory. She remembered faces, laughter, tears. She remembered the warmth of being held, the joy of walking beside another who understood her. She remembered the touch of a hand, gentle, trusting, close to her heart. But those memories brought her no comfort. Instead, they cut like blades. For she remembered how it all ended. She had lost them all, one by one, until she was the only one left standing in the ruins. The nights were the worst. During the day, she could keep herself busy. She wandered the cliffs, gathered food from the valleys, watched the winds move across the world. But at night, when the stars came out, there was nothing to distract her. She would lie upon the stone staring at the infinite dark sky, and she would feel smaller than ever before despite her enormous size. It was in those moments that she wished more than anything for a voice beside her, for someone to say her name and remind her she was not forgotten. Sometimes she sang. Her voice, deep and rich, rolled across the mountains like a wave. But the songs always ended in silence. No harmony joined her, no voices rose to meet her own. The songs of her people were now only her burden to carry. She often wondered why fate had left her behind. Why her? Why not someone else, someone who deserved companionship? Why had she been chosen to remember what the rest of the universe had erased? The giantess walked through her days with slow, heavy steps. Each step shook the ground, leaving deep marks upon the soil. Birds would scatter, animals would flee, as if her presence itself was too much for the land to bear. She hated this. She hated that even the smallest creatures feared her. She longed not for fear, but for connection. She wished that someone might see her not as a monster, but as a soul. Yet the universe was cruelly silent. Time stretched on, and still she remained alone. She tried to tell herself she was strong enough, that she did not need anyone. But the truth pressed against her heart. Strength meant nothing without someone to share it with. She had everything, size, power, endurance, but she had nothing that mattered. And so the giantess waited. She did not know what she was waiting for, or if she was waiting at all. But deep within her, buried under years of sorrow, a spark remained. A quiet hope that one day someone might come. Someone small perhaps, but brave enough to stand before her. Someone who would not run, who would not fear. Someone who might touch her heart and remind her what it meant to be alive. Until then, she sat in her valley, her silver eyes watching the sky. She was a giant in body, but inside she was only a lonely soul searching for peace in a world that had forgotten her. The night sky burned with fire. At first, the giantess thought it was only another falling star. She had seen many before, their brief light vanishing into the endless dark. But this one was different. It did not fade. It grew brighter, splitting the heavens with trails of flame until it roared across the mountains like a wounded beast. She rose to her feet, her silver eyes wide. The light fell lower, breaking apart, scattering fragments that lit the world like day. A thunderous crash shook the valley as the largest piece struck the earth beyond the ridges. Smoke rose, thick and black, curling toward the sky. Her heart, long silent, began to pound. Something inside called her forward. Without hesitation, she walked across the darkened valley, her heavy steps echoing through the night. She did not know why she moved. She did not know what she hoped to find. But after centuries of silence, this falling star felt different. When she reached the crash site, the ground was torn apart. Trees were broken, the soil burned, and at the center lay a small broken vessel. Strange metal twisted and glowing red with heat. She had never seen such a thing before. She approached carefully, the ground trembling beneath her. Then she heard it, a sound so small, so fragile that she almost thought it was the wind. A cry, a voice. The giantess froze. Her breath caught in her chest. Could it be possible? She bent low, her enormous shadow covering the wreckage. Inside the torn metal, something moved. Not fire, not stone, but life. A small figure crawled weakly from the broken shell. Compared to her, he was tiny, no taller than her hand. His body shook as he pulled himself forward. Blood stained his side and his clothes were torn. Yet he still struggled to rise, to fight against the pain. Her silver eyes softened. This was no star. This was someone. A being she had never seen before. Fragile, small, and yet alive. The human lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither moved. She expected him to scream, to run, to cower as all smaller creatures did. But he did not. His gaze trembled with fear, yes, but also with something else. Courage. His lips parted, and in a weak, broken voice he whispered, "Help." The giantess, felt her heart twist. Centuries of silence broke in that single word. Help. No one had asked her for anything in so long. No one had trusted her strength, her hands, her heart. But here he was, a fragile creature, asking her for life itself. Her hands shook as she reached down. She was afraid her fingers might crush him, afraid her strength might harm instead of protect. Yet she could not leave him. With all the care she could summon, she slipped her hand beneath his tiny body and lifted him from the wreckage. He was so light, lighter than a leaf. She held him close, her breath slow and steady, afraid even the rhythm of her chest might harm him. His eyes, though tired, looked up at her. He did not scream. He did not turn away. Instead, he whispered again, this time softer. "Thank you." Her heart broke open. No one had spoken to her like that in lifetimes. No one had looked at her without fear. No one had given her such a simple gift. Gratitude. The giantess lowered herself to the ground, placing the human gently on a smooth stone. She watched him breathe, weak but alive. She felt something strange inside her, something she had not felt in centuries. Hope. For the first time in an age, she was not completely alone. The falling star had brought her something more than fire and ruin. It had brought her a fragile being who, against all reason, trusted her. The giantess did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if this tiny creature would live, or if he would fade like the rest of her people had. But as she looked at him, small, broken, yet unafraid, she felt a new truth stir within her heart. Perhaps fate had not abandoned her after all. Perhaps the universe had sent her this fragile star not to destroy, but to save. And as the night grew quiet once more, the lonely giantess held her breath, listening to the small sound of human life. It was the sweetest sound she had heard in centuries. The days after the crash were unlike anything the giantess had ever known. For the first time in centuries, she was not walking alone through the valleys. She had a guest, small, fragile, and utterly different from her, yet alive in her world of silence. The human, though weak and wounded, carried a spirit that amazed her. At first, she kept her distance. She placed him in a safe hollow near the cliffs where the wind could not reach. She gathered fruit and water from the streams and left them beside him. She feared to stay too close. Her size terrified even herself. What if her breath was too strong? What if her shadow weighed too heavily? But whenever she stepped back, his eyes followed her, not with fear, but with a strange kind of trust. The human healed slowly. His wounds closed, his strength returned little by little. He spoke often, his voice soft but steady. His words were strange to her, but with time she began to understand. He told her his name, though to her it was a sound so small she was afraid to say it aloud in case her thunderous voice might break it. He told her he was from a faraway world, one filled with oceans that stretched farther than even her eyes could see, with forests so green they looked like living rivers, with cities that glowed brighter than the stars. The giantess listened. She had no words to offer, only silence and the slow nod of her head, but in her heart she felt warmth blooming. Each story he told painted colors in her mind she had forgotten existed. She imagined oceans that moved like living glass. She imagined cities filled with lights that never dimmed. She imagined laughter, thousands of voices joined together, a sound her soul longed to hear again. Sometimes, when he was strong enough, the human would walk out of his shelter and sit upon the stone, looking up at her. His tiny figure against her towering body looked almost impossible. Yet in his eyes there was no fear. He would point at the stars and speak of constellations, shapes his people gave to the lights in the sky. She had seen those stars for centuries, but until he spoke, they had only been silent fires to her. Through his voice, they became stories, alive and bright. The giantess found herself waiting for his words each day. She would wake and look toward his shelter, her chest easing only when she saw him stirring, when she heard his voice greeting the morning. She did not understand why such a small being had so much power over her heart. But she knew this. Her valley no longer felt empty, and yet fear lived in her still. Whenever the human tried to come closer, whenever his small hand reached for her skin, she pulled back. The memory of her strength haunted her. Long ago she had held another close, too close, and lost them forever. The thought of hurting this fragile creature with her careless size filled her with dread. So she kept her distance, even though her heart longed to bridge it. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the human stood at the edge of his shelter and looked up at her. His voice was quiet but steady as he said, "You saved me. You keep me safe. Why do you fear me?" Her silver eyes dimmed. She lowered her gaze, her words rolling out like soft thunder. "Because my hands destroy. My strength is a curse. I do not want to break what little I have left." The human shook his head. Though so small, his voice cut through the vastness between them. "No, your strength is why I am alive. You don't destroy, you protect." The giantess froze. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let those words sink deep, to erase the fear that chained her heart. But her scars were old and her doubt heavy. She turned her face away, hiding the storm in her eyes. Still, when the night fell and stars filled the sky, she heard his voice again. Soft, steady, unafraid. He was not running. He was not hiding. He was staying. And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps he truly saw her, not as a monster, not as a curse, but as someone worth trusting. The giantess lay upon the stone ground, her gaze fixed on the stars he had named. And in the silence of that night, she felt something fragile and new stirring within her. A bond. Delicate, uncertain, but real. For centuries, she had lived with only echoes. Now she lived with a voice small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, yet strong enough to begin healing the wounds of her heart. Days passed in quiet routine. The human grew stronger, moving with more confidence across the stone valley. He laughed sometimes, a sound so small yet so bright. It seemed to light up the giantess's shadowed world. She watched him, fascinated and terrified. Fascinated because he brought warmth into her long, lonely life, and terrified because she knew the danger she carried in her every movement. She remembered the pain of the past. Long ago she had tried to love, to hold another close. But her strength, though natural to her, had been too much. She had crushed them unintentionally, and the memory haunted her to this day. The echoes of that tragedy were like chains around her heart, and she could not free herself from them. So she avoided the human's touch. She let him speak, let him move, let him tell stories of his faraway world. But she stayed just out of reach. Even when he laughed at her awkward attempts to mimic his tiny gestures, she would withdraw, worried that she might, without meaning to, harm him. Yet the human did not complain. He did not retreat. Instead, he grew bolder in his own gentle way. He would place food near her feet, trying to make her smile. He would hum small songs and watch her eyes light up at the unfamiliar sound. And sometimes, when she least expected it, he would inch closer, offering his tiny hand. Not demanding, not fearing, but trusting. The first time he touched her hand, she flinched. Her enormous fingers hovered above his. Trembling with the fear she could crush him in a heartbeat, she looked down at him, and his eyes full of trust and courage met hers. "You're not going to hurt me," he said softly. "I know you're gentle. I can feel it." Her silver eyes widened. How could this fragile being, so small and delicate, see the truth about her heart when she herself could not? She wanted to believe him, to let him close, but the weight of her fear anchored her in place. She turned away, speaking only in a low, hesitant voice. I cannot, I am too strong. I touched, it could destroy you." But he shook his head. Tiny as he was, his presence filled the space between them. No, you saved me. You kept me alive. How could you destroy me when you gave me life? The words struck her like a lightning bolt, shaking centuries of sorrow from her soul. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the space between them, to feel the warmth of life she had not touched in so long. And yet doubt clung to her like a second skin. She had been alone for so long that the idea of trusting, of letting someone so close, felt impossible. The valley grew still around them as night fell. Stars blinked overhead, familiar yet somehow different in the human's presence. She watched him carefully, noting the rise and fall of his chest as he slept on the smooth stone she had prepared. His vulnerability was breathtaking, and the fear that she could harm him nearly overwhelmed her. She wanted to curl around him to protect him with every inch of her immense body, but the memory of past loss froze her in place. All night she stayed awake, her heart torn. On one side was the fear of repeating history, of losing another life because of her size. On the other side was a strange, powerful longing, a desire to be close, to feel the warmth of trust in her hands, to finally break free from centuries of loneliness. By dawn, she realized something important. Fear might live in her, but it could no longer rule her entirely. She had watched this human fight to survive, had seen him trust her against all reason, and in return, a small but steady light began to burn in her heart. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine something new, that she could be more than a solitary shadow in the valley. That perhaps with this fragile being beside her, she could learn what it meant to live again, not just to survive, but to hope, to care, and maybe to love. The giantess sat in the quiet morning, gazing down at the sleeping human. Her silver eyes reflected both fear and hope. And deep inside, something shifted. For the first time, she considered that her heart, long frozen in sorrow, might be ready to awaken. The morning was calm, almost peaceful, and the giantess allowed herself a quiet smile as she watched the human move through the valley. He seemed stronger now, walking carefully along the stones, picking small fruits and occasionally glancing up at her with a smile that warmed her silver eyes. She had never thought she could feel such tenderness in her long, lonely life, but peace, she knew, was fragile. By afternoon, the wind began to shift. It whispered through the ridges, carrying a strange tension that set her instincts on edge. Dark clouds gathered above the valley, thick and heavy, blotting out the sunlight. A storm was coming, stronger than anything she had ever seen. The human noticed it too. He paused, looking at the sky with wide eyes, a frown creasing his forehead. "We should go back," he said softly. "I think a storm is coming." She watched him, torn between pride in his bravery and worry for his small, fragile body. The valley was vast, but even she could not shield him from the full power of the storm without exposing herself. The winds were rising, carrying cold rain that began to lash against the stones. Lightning split the sky in jagged streaks, illuminating her towering figure against the darkened clouds. The human tried to run back to the shelter she had built for him, but a sudden gust sent him sprawling against the ground. He struggled to rise, his small body battered by the wind. The giantess's heart leapt into her throat. Without thinking, she rushed forward, her massive strides shaking the earth beneath her. She reached him in moments, though for him it must have felt like an eternity. She crouched low, her enormous arms forming a protective wall around him. Rain and debris pelted her shoulders, but she did not flinch. Every movement was deliberate, careful, as if the storm itself could not harm the fragile life she held in her hands. "Hold on," she shouted, her voice booming against the wind. But he had already reached for her finger, gripping it with tiny hands. His trust astounded her. He was not afraid, even as the storm tore through the valley around them. Lightning struck nearby and rocks tumbled down the cliffs. She shielded him with her massive body, taking the full force of the storm. Her hair whipped around her face like silver fire, her skin glistening with rain, but she did not falter. She felt the earth tremble beneath her feet, and yet her focus never left the human she carried. Hours seemed to pass like minutes. The storm raged, unrelenting, but she refused to let go. The human's small hands remained locked on hers, his trust anchoring her heart against the fear and memory that had haunted her for centuries. His presence reminded her of the warmth she had almost forgotten. Finally, as night began to fall, the storm slowly weakened. The winds lost their ferocity, the rain turned to gentle droplets, and the clouds began to break apart. The valley was battered and scarred, but the human was safe. She lowered him to the ground carefully, exhausted but unbroken. He looked up at her, eyes shining through wet hair, a small smile on his lips. "You're amazing," he whispered. "You kept me safe. You saved me." Her silver eyes glistened with tears. She had saved many creatures before, yes, but never had she felt the connection, the gratitude, the fragile trust that coursed between them. For the first time, she realized that her size and power were not curses, they were gifts. Gifts that could protect, not destroy. Gifts that could bridge the gap between loneliness and life. She knelt beside him, her massive face close to his small one. "You trust me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, still unsure of her own heart. He nodded. "I do. I trust you." The giantess felt something stir deep within her, a warmth, a light, a heartbeat she had not heard for centuries. In the chaos of the storm, in the howling wind and the crashing rocks, something stronger than fear had awakened inside her. She had protected not just a life, but a soul. And in doing so, she had begun to protect her own heart as well. That night, as the valley lay quiet under a sky scattered with stars, the giantess stayed close. She did not fully understand the feelings growing inside her, but she knew one thing: she was no longer alone. The human's fragile trust had broken the walls around her heart, and for the first time in centuries she allowed herself to feel hope. The storm had passed, leaving the valley drenched but calm. Water streamed down the cliffs in tiny waterfalls, and the air smelled of wet stone and new beginnings. The giantess stood silently, looking down at the human who now moved with cautious confidence. He had survived the fury of the storm, and she had survived with him. Yet something inside her had shifted. Something fragile and powerful stirred in the depths of her heart. The human approached her slowly, his small figure moving against her towering form. She knelt, lowering herself so that she would not appear too frightening. Even now, after everything, she still feared her own strength. Every muscle, every motion could harm him without meaning to. But he came forward unafraid. His eyes met hers, shining with a quiet determination. "You saved me," he said softly. "And now, I want to help you." She blinked, unsure of what he meant. He took a tiny step closer and then another, until his hands were resting against her enormous palm. She froze, the memory of centuries of solitude and loss pressing against her chest. She wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of distance, but his gaze held hers unwavering, filled with trust she had not known she could still feel. "You trust me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I do," he whispered. "I trust you. And I know you're not alone anymore." Her silver eyes filled with tears. She had believed for centuries that her heart had hardened, that it could never love again. And yet, here was this fragile being, so small, so human, holding her hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And in that simple, gentle touch, something inside her began to awaken. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his tiny palm against hers. It was not a threat. It did not crush. It did not demand. It gave. It offered life, trust, and connection. She felt centuries of loneliness begin to melt away, carried off by the simple truth of his presence. Her heart, long frozen, began to beat again, strong, steady, alive. The human spoke again, softly, almost like a prayer. "You're not alone. You don't have to be." For the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel. Pain, sorrow, fear, they still lingered, but they were no longer chains. They were reminders of how far she had come, how much she had survived. And now there was something new, hope, tender, fragile, but real. She wrapped her enormous fingers around his tiny hands with care, letting herself be present in this moment of trust. He smiled up at her, unafraid, and she smiled back, a soft curve of her lips, gentle and unguarded. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself had noticed the bond forming in that quiet valley. She had waited for centuries, expecting nothing, believing herself destined for endless solitude. And yet here was life, small and human, teaching her that even a giantess could be touched, healed, and awakened. The wind moved through the cliffs, but it was no longer cold or empty. It carried a warmth that mirrored her own heart. The giantess realized that she did not need to fear her strength when it was used with care, and she did not need to fear connection when trust was offered so freely. She felt the weight of her own loneliness lift, replaced by something she had almost forgotten: the possibility of love, of companionship, of peace. She lowered her head closer to the human, her silver eyes glistening with tears and wonder. He looked up at her without fear, holding her hand as if it were the most natural act in the world. In that moment, nothing else existed. The storm, the valley, the centuries of sorrow. There was only the gentle touch that had awakened her heart, and the fragile trust that had given her life back to herself. For the first time in ages, the giantess felt truly alive. She had been lonely, forgotten and broken, but now with this small human beside her she understood that even the largest hearts could be healed. And in his touch, she found the peace she had been searching for centuries. The valley was quiet now. The storm had passed completely, leaving the world washed clean, the cliffs shining faintly in the light of a rising sun. The giantess stood at the edge of her mountains, looking down at the human who moved through the grass with a newfound confidence. He was no longer fragile in the same way. He had survived the crash, the storm, and countless moments that would have defeated a lesser being. She watched him with something she had not felt for centuries: pride. Not the kind of pride that came from strength or size, but the kind that comes from caring, from protecting, from loving. The human had changed her. His small courage had unraveled centuries of solitude, and his gentle presence had opened her heart in ways she could not have imagined. For the first time, she felt that she did not need to hide her enormous self. She did not need to fear that her size, her power, her very existence would drive away the only being who had seen her for who she truly was. She could be herself, giant, silver-eyed, and still capable of tenderness. And he accepted her fully, without hesitation, without fear. The human climbed a small rock to reach a little closer to her face. His hand lifted to touch her cheek. She froze, heart pounding, memories of centuries-long loneliness and past mistakes pressing against her chest. But he did not flinch. He did not pull back. His touch was gentle, careful, full of trust. And in that single moment she understood everything she had longed for. That connection, that trust, that fragile bridge between hearts, could survive even the greatest differences. "You're amazing," he whispered, his small hand resting against her cheek. "I never thought I could meet someone like you." She smiled, tears spilling down her face like rivers of silver. "And I never thought I could feel this again," she replied softly. Her voice carried a mixture of awe, relief, and wonder. For centuries she had walked alone, her enormous shadow stretching across empty valleys. Now she felt that shadow lift, not because the world had changed, but because her heart had. They spent the day together, walking slowly through the valley. She bent low to allow him to step beside her, her hand hovering near his, ready to protect, ready to guide. They spoke in quiet tones, sharing stories, laughter, and dreams. The human told her about his homeworld, about oceans and forests, about people who lived in cities filled with light and music. She listened, captivated, imagining these distant lands, and slowly, for the first time in ages, she felt hope blossom in her heart. By nightfall, the stars above shone brighter than ever. She raised her silver eyes to the sky, feeling the vastness of the universe settle over her shoulders. But instead of loneliness, she felt peace. She was no longer the last. She was no longer alone. In the human beside her, she had found a companion, a friend, a bond that healed the centuries of emptiness inside her. He leaned against her hand, small and trusting, and she lowered herself to sit beside him. The ground trembled slightly under her weight, but she was no longer afraid, for she had learned that strength was not something to fear, it was something to protect with. And love, no matter how fragile, could thrive even in the heart of a giant. I think I am home," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "You are," he said, smiling. "And you're never alone again." The wind carried their words across the valley. It whispered through the cliffs and over the grass, a soft song that seemed to echo all that had passed, the years of sorrow, the storms, the small moments of trust that had built a bridge between two unlikely souls. And in that song, the giantess felt her heart fill completely for the first time in centuries. The galaxy might have forgotten her, but it no longer mattered. She had been given life again through the courage and gentleness of one small human. He had awakened her heart, healed her wounds, and shown her that even the loneliest souls could find connection, peace, and hope. As the stars shimmered overhead, she rested her massive hand near him, feeling the warmth of life and trust in his tiny fingers. She closed her eyes and let herself feel every emotion she had long denied: relief, joy, love, and the quiet certainty that she was finally home, both in the valley she had walked for centuries and in her own heart. The lonely giantess had found peace, and in that peace she would never be alone again.